All right, good morning again. Welcome to the second part of our forum, which will be the panelist discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm going to start with Dr. Robin D'Angelo, who is an affiliate associate professor of education at the University of Washington. In addition, she holds 2 honorary doctorates. She is a 2-time winner of the Student's Choice Award for Educator of the Year at the University of Washington School of Social Work. She is the co-author of the award-winning textbook, Is Everyone Really Equal? Key Concepts in Critical Social Justice Education. In 2011, she coined the term white fragility in an academic article which has influenced the international dialogue on race. Her book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, spent 3 years on the New York Times bestseller list and has been translated into 12 languages.
Who is an affiliate associate professor of education at the University of Washington. In addition,
that's my doppelganger. Her work and interviews have been featured on CBS, MSNBC, the New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC, NPR, and PBS, among many other forums. In addition to her academic work, Dr. D'Angelo has been a consultant and educator for over 25 years on issues of racial and social justice. Dr. D'Angelo, welcome.
spent 3 years on the New York Times bestseller list and has been...
Dang, I just won't shut up. David Schultz is Distinguished University Professor in the Departments of Political Science, Environmental Studies, and Legal Studies here at Hamline University. He also holds adjunct appointments at the University of Minnesota and at the University of St. Thomas Schools of Law and at the Lithuania Military Academy. A 4-time Fulbright scholar who has taught extensively in Europe and Asia, and the winner of the Leslie A. Whittington National Award for Excellence in Public Affairs Teaching. David Schultz is the author of more than 45 books, 200-plus articles on various aspects of American politics, election law, the First Amendment, police reform, and the media and politics. He is regularly interviewed and quoted in the local, national, and international media on these subjects, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, The Economist, and National Public Radio. David Schultz, welcome to our panel. Tim Wise is among the most prominent and anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He has spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states, on over 1,500 college and high school campuses, at hundreds of professional and academic conferences, and to community groups across the country. Wise has also trained corporate, government, entertainment, media, law enforcement, military, and medical industry professionals on methods for dismantling racial inequity in their institutions, and has provided anti-racism training to educators and administrators nationwide and internationally. Wise is the author of 9 books, including his latest, Dispatches from the Race War. Wise has contributed chapters or essays to over 25 additional books, and his writings are taught in colleges and universities across the nation. Please join me in welcoming Tim Wise. And our final panelist is Professor Stacey Hawkins, an award-winning teacher and scholar. She formerly served as the Vice Dean of Rutgers Law School in Camden, where she also teaches courses in constitutional law, employment law, and an original seminar on diversity and the law. She is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the 2023 Chancellor's Award for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leadership, the 2022 BLSA Champion for Social Justice Award, and the 2018 AALS Derek A. Bell Award, which is given to those junior faculty who exemplify a commitment to diversity and critical race theory in their teaching, scholarship, and service. She was also named Faculty of the Year by the graduating class of 2013 and Co-Professor of the Year by the graduating class of 2018. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stacey Hawkins. And finally, our moderator, Denise Holloman, a principal and chief advisor of DAH Operations Advisors. She retired in 2015 from her position at General Mills as VP of Project Management Office and Global Continuous Improvement. Prior to this, Holloman had been Vice President of Manufacturing and Continuous Improvement, responsible for system engineering, maintenance reliability, technical training, business simulation, and continuous improvement. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Denise Holloman.
And he didn't add this little piece, but one thing I want to make certain everyone understands is that I'm really proud to be here. I'm a big fan and advocate for Hamlin University and the proud parent of a Hamlin graduate. So that's my connection. And probably the other piece is that I've been a board member of Hamlin since 2013. So my roots run deep, and I'm glad to be here. And I also must give this disclaimer, I'm a fan of Dr. Miller, because I was part of the search committee when we found her, so recognize, and I must make certain I state that up front. So with that, we had a very, I tell you, moving keynote this morning. And it really hit me deeply, particularly as someone who's a child of the South, grew up in the 60s, went into engineering from that little North Avenue trade school called Georgia Tech, where someone who looked like me was an anomaly in the late 70s, and in a profession where people who looked like me were literally, you got a degree and you never practiced it. I retired leading engineering, manufacturing, etc. So many of his words really hit home, and you were taught early in that they didn't expect you to make it. And so you've got to have a very clear mind that it is not what people do, but a lot of times it's the institutions and what you've been socialized to believe, and we've always got to make certain we keep that front of mind. And so with that, I'd like to start by asking Dr. Hawkins, how did the comments of Professor Dyson strike you? What are some of your initial reactions?
Hallelujah and amen. I think that he was spot on. I think that the reason I am on this panel is because of an article that I wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Education that really implored us as institutions of higher education, as part of the larger academic enterprise, to be mindful of the necessity to balance the interest in academic freedom and free speech with the commitment to fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion in our communities. And I think that, you know, he made all of the kind of points about why that's so critically important, not just historical, but contemporary. And I think that that's what we're here to talk about, why that's important, how we do that, and what the consequences of failing to do that well are, and what the benefits of achieving those goals might be.
And so I'd like to then move on to Dr. Schultz. What are some of your thoughts?
What are my thoughts? There's an expression that says, in theory, theory is always right, but in practice, theory is not always correct. And the reason why I start off by saying that is that I will say I probably agree with 100% of what you say, the critique. I also know, having majored in philosophy, having done advanced work in philosophy, I can rattle off Habermas, Derrida, I can rattle off all that stuff. But to me, at the end of the day, the bottom line is, what do we do in practice? What do we do when we really get down to saying, how do we reconcile diversity and academic freedom? And I'm going to eventually make the argument and say that there's not an opposition to it. But what I really want to say in terms of the argument here is that I listened to some of the questions, I listened to some of the observations, and people were talking about saying, well, maybe we can borrow from business. Maybe we can borrow from business what they're doing. And what I want to say is that what I think is the larger threat to diversity, the larger threat to academic freedom, is the corporatization of the university and of higher education in America. It is across the board the fact that we see a top-down directed curriculum It is the fact that we increasingly describe students as consumers, as as consumers of knowledge. It is the idea of saying that we are going to create a cookie cutter approach to how education is performed. It is also at a point where corporate America has so infected and influenced higher education that we're down to what now? Barely 25%, maybe 30% at most, of the faculty have academic freedom in any sense of what? They no longer have tenure. Very few have tenure anymore. It is about the fact that in many ways, all the guardrails that place limits on the ability of outside forces and on the ability of corporate leaders in higher education to dictate curriculum, that's lost. And with that loss is increasingly the fear for many faculty that they can't challenge students. They can't raise questions. They can't approach ideas for fear that they will not have a job come next year.
How about you?
Well, all of that, I would reiterate, but I would say that listening to Mike, the thing that I appreciated so much and the thing that it triggered for me was an appreciation, a recognition of how readily we abstract these hive-minded philosophical concepts like freedom. And when I say we do that, I mean I'm talking about white people, if you're not clear on that. I don't think black and brown folks abstract the notion of freedom because it's a concrete reality which in its absence has led to their death and destruction, enslavement, and mistreatment. But for white Americans, we have had the ability to abstract the notion of freedom, talk about it like this high-minded principle while not actually believing in it. And so he told you that Thomas Jefferson wrote those pretty words while owning and raping human beings. He said all men were created equal. He did not mean it. It was an abstraction. So when we talk about academic freedom, we talk about freedom of speech. The people who talk about it in absolutist terms, as in, I want to say what I want to say because I've got a right to do it, are almost always the people for whom power has allowed them to take that position, not worry about the consequences of their actions, and run roughshod over the rights and liberties of others. Now, as a critical race theorist, yes, that thing that nobody really understands but everybody wants to talk about, as a critical race theorist, I think about freedom in substantive versus non-substantive terms. In other words, you may have the freedom to engage in racist invective in speech, or Islamophobic invective in speech, or anti-Semitic invective in speech, but the more that you're allowed to do that, you may actually restrict the freedom of speech of the people in the classrooms or on the campuses who now feel that they cannot speak, especially if you're in a position of authority and power. So then substantive free speech is diminished. Substantive academic freedom is diminished, just like critical race theorists talk about equal protection, 14th Amendment, in a different way than many other legal scholars. There is equal protection, and then there is substantive equal protection. There are ways that you can go about the law, ways that you can go about academic policy that may maximize the front-end freedom of people with power, but have the effect of diminishing the back-end freedom of everyone else. It's like if we allow people to carry weapons to every Proud Boy rally or the rally in Charlottesville, the Nazi march in Charlottesville, and there's a big debate within the ACLU and the free speech community, First Amendment community about, well, should we defend their right to free speech when they're bringing weapons? And there's an argument to be made that the bringing of weapons is so intimidating of other people's freedom to assemble and to speak that you actually have the effect of diminishing the whole. And so we cannot talk about academic freedom, freedom of speech, the First Amendment, or any amendment to the Constitution that guarantees some liberty in that abstract sense because of the second thing Mike pointed out, made such a clear point, which is that the creation of community is as much a part of the college's mission as the search for truth. The search for truth part says we want all the speech we can handle because that's how we're going to discern truth. Now, I don't know how saying the N-word helps you find truth. Might help you find a fist to the face. But if you think you need to be able to articulate every truth to get to some abstract wisdom, fine. But the building of community is also why we're here. It's why we have residence halls. It's why we have clubs on campus. It's why we don't just turn college into a book club. If you were just looking for truth and information, they could just send out books and give you a curriculum and you could do it all from home. But you're here in a physical space sharing community, and you have to be able to balance the right to be whatever kind of asshole you want to be right? With the need to build community. You can go in the middle of Central Park and shout the N-word all you want, and if you do so, it makes you an asshole. And I get to call you an asshole. And when I call you that, I'm not restricting your freedom of speech. I'm just making a simple point that you shit in the street. And I'm going to point it out. That's a Southernism, by the way. And I'm from the South, and we use that kind of imagery. I apologize for it. Some of y'all, Mike's trying to eat something. I apologize, brother. But you understand that we have to look at these things in these non-abstract and non-binary ways. And that's what I appreciated so much about what Mike had to say.
Thank you so much. And so, Robin, what are your thoughts?
Wow. Well, first, it's an honor to share the stage with you all. It's an honor to Dr. Miller, always brother, and thank you for allowing me to come on. There were so many points that by of pandemic Michael laid out, but one profession is a development and critical thinking, expression of opinion, right? It deeply about knowledge is created, historical context is produced. He gave the example Jefferson about the national that we sing, written in 18 of the free, right? Lorraine Code, philosopher, who has a quote that I think is dynamic, from whose activity ideal activity come. In other words, from whose position, who gets to claim that they are objective and that everyone else has an agenda, right? So the mainstream curriculum is presented as neutral and objective, and anyone who challenges that has an agenda or is coming from a subjective position. So the more you understand the limitations of your position, particularly, and like Tim, my work is focused on white identity and the reproduction of white supremacy and whiteness from the position as a white person. The more you understand how that position shapes what you see, what you don't see, the closer you can get to this ideal of objectivity, right? There is no neutral space or neutral position.
I apologize, Robin, that people missed the very intro that you began this with. Could you go back to those first probably 4 sentences that you articulated about what Dr. Dyson said? Because I think that's critical, because you laid the groundwork for this concept of the perception of neutrality.
Was that a question? I didn't hear your first part.
I wanted
Was
you
that
to repeat your first 4 sentences where you laid the groundwork for this concept of neutrality.
My first 4, I'm not sure what my first 4 sentences were. Do you?
Just the beginning
So
part, Rob.
critical
Just the beginning
thinking
part.
is foundation. Oh, I'm so sorry. Are you speaking to me?
Yes, I was speaking to you, Robin, because we did not have your full thoughts at the very beginning. And so you laid a nice foundation for the final piece, which is this concept of neutrality, which really isn't neutrality. And so I wanted to make certain we got back and had you repeat that.
Thank you for that. All right. So there are various functions of academic institutions. And Michael identified some of those. Some of them are spoken, some of them are unspoken. But one of them is the development of critical thinking. And critical thinking is not just the expression of opinion, as if all opinions are equal and all opinions matter. Everyone has an opinion pretty much on everything, but that doesn't make it informed. And I think a lot of faculty kind of get caught up in this idea that we have to validate everyone's opinion. And students certainly come into the classroom thinking that that's going to be the norm there. We each get to say what we think, and it's all equal of value. Well, some of our opinions are informed, and academic institutions have a process called peer review, where others in your field are engaged in ongoing dialogue, challenge, study, and so forth. So critical thinking always acknowledges where does knowledge come from? How do we trace the past into the present, right? We cannot address the problems we have in the present if we are denied understanding how we came to them, right? How is knowledge circulated? Whose knowledge is validated? Whose is not validated? And so forth. And then that led me into there is no objectivity, but the closer you are to understanding the position from which you speak, the closer you can get to some sense of objectivity.
Thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to really roll into some planned questions, but I want to open it up by reading that during the second annual meeting of the General Report of the Committee on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure, it was asserted that an adequate discussion of academic freedom must necessarily consider three matters. One, the scope and basis of power by those in authority. Two, the nature of the academic calling. And three, the function of the academic institution or university. And so what I'd like to do is have you share your thoughts on these principles and their impact on academic freedom and cultural perspectives. And we'll start on this end with Mr. Wise.
I think it's really important to think about, particularly the power concept as it relates to academic freedom in an institutional space like a college or university. And the reason I say that is, look, when those principles were articulated, whenever, 1940, or when the First Amendment was articulated quite a bit before that, obviously, these notions of freedom, these notions of liberty to speak, or in the case of academic freedom to teach, were being written by people who may have believed in them as principles. I don't know. I think for some it was much more abstract, like I said before. But even if they did believe in them, let's be clear, one thing they also believed in was they wanted to keep their positions of power. None of them were articulating academic freedom with the idea that maybe somebody will challenge my perspective and replace my ass next year. Like, they wanted to keep their jobs, they wanted to maintain power, and they didn't feel that maximum freedom threatened that in any way, or they never would have articulated that principle. They wanted job security. So here you had people articulating the notion of academic freedom, knowing full well that they would have sufficient power to maintain themselves in those positions of authority, no matter how much freedom was articulated. They weren't pure libertarians saying, well, maybe I won't have a job in 10 years. You know, it's fine, though. I just really want to live and die on the principle. No, they wanted the paycheck, right? So what that means is we have to have a discussion about power, because to think about academic freedom without understanding that there is a definite power imbalance in the classroom, there is a definite power imbalance between the dean of students and the students, between the administration and the students, that there are balances in power between graduate level students and undergraduate level students. If you don't understand that, then you're acting as if we're all just operating in some blank slate space where we can all just maximize our freedom, but some people are constrained in doing that, and it's the job of an institution to try to balance out that power. You're never going to balance it out perfectly, right? You're never going to be able to come up with necessarily the perfect balance there, but you have to be willing to engage those conversations at a deep level if you're going to give substantive meaning to a concept like academic freedom. Yeah.
How about you, Professor Hawkins?
So the first thing I want to do is make a slight amendment to my prior statement, because I'm going to play the lawyer in the room for a moment. There's been a lot of reference to the idea that people have a right to do and say whatever they want. And I teach constitutional law, and one of the things that I tell all of my students is that no right that you possess in this grand country called America is ever absolute. No absolute rights exist in this country. Rights are always mediated by other interests. And so this notion that whether it's free speech or academic freedom, that these principles, that these ideas, that these rights are absolute, is simply false. And that's true as a matter of First Amendment law, but it's also true as a matter of the kind of concept of academic freedom that emanates from the AAUP. And so I think that that's a very important thing to put on the table. People don't necessarily have the right to say the N-word in a classroom or anywhere else. And one clear example of that, right, is that those people who are currently being prosecuted, found guilty, and sentenced to jail time, right, for advocating the overthrow of the government, now understand that you don't have any free speech rights, right, to advocate for the overthrow of the government, right? Our First Amendment doesn't actually protect that. Our federal government criminalizes that conduct, and there is no amount of First Amendment rights that you can assert in defense of that conduct. And so there are times in which we necessarily have to restrict your rights because, as Justice Stevens once said about gun rights, there are liberty interests on both sides of this issue. Your right to speak can't come at the expense of other people's right to safety, right to liberty, right to freedom, right to dignity, right to an education, a right to know, right, the truth about our history, if we're talking about critical race theory. So I do think that that is a false idea. It is a fundamental falsehood that we talk about these rights in absolute terms ever, because they don't exist in absolute terms. But to now go back to your point about this statement, which, by the way, I looked it up, that general report from the second annual meeting was from 1915. And in 1915, I also looked it up. The committee that was comprised of the faculty who authored that report were 15 white men, not surprisingly, right? Who authored it on behalf of similarly situated white men, all, by the way, hailing from elite educational institutions, written nominally on behalf of students who were also largely, if not exclusively, all white men. So when we talk about power and authority, one of the questions that I always like to raise is who has the power and authority to decide, right, these things? Who's creating the structure, the system within which we are all then being forced to operate? And so this general meeting reminded me of another, and the Reverend Dr. Dyson mentioned the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson, and while that was a project, right, that was kind of a false promise from the very start, as a constitutional law professor, it also reminded me of another founding document, which is our constitutional. And our founding framers also were comprised of all white, land-owning, gentried white men. And so again, that project was flawed from its very inception because it constructed a system that, while the goals might have seemed lofty and they might have seemed desirable, right, were made on behalf of a less than full complement of the citizenry. And in that sense was necessarily inadequate to the task of really being inclusive of all of our interests, to the point where our Constitution had to be remade during Reconstruction, right, to take account of the fact that there were significant numbers of now, right, thanks to the 14th Amendment, citizens, Black persons, who were a part of our political project, whose interest had been entirely absent, right, who did not exercise any power or any authority to determine the rules of engagement. And I think that we have to think the same way about the general report, right? That whatever they said, whatever they thought they were saying about academic freedom was being said on behalf of less than a full complement of the people who now occupy the spaces that these rules of engagement, right, govern. And so we have to think anew, just like we had a kind of a constitutional reconstruction. We need to have a reconstruction about our ideas about academic freedom, taking into full consideration everyone who now occupies these spaces and the interest, right, that they bring to bear. And I like to say there is no academic freedom without diversity, because if academic freedom is on behalf of the academic enterprise, it has to necessarily include all of us. It has to reflect all of our interests and our ability to participate and engage fully. And so I say that, again, we need to rethink these things anew. We need to understand that those founding ideas, although lofty and ambitious, and they seem in theory, right, in practice, they were woefully inadequate. And so now we are bumping up against that inadequacy, and it's causing all of us to really rethink critically what our terms of engagement ought to be.
Thank you very much. Professor Schultz.
Sure. 2 words I want to start off with. One is going to be, what's going to be shared governance is going to be the first, and the second is going to be community. And the reason why I say that is that I think everybody's hitting at something very similar here. On the one hand, it's about power and control. It's about who gets a seat at the table, who gets to decide within the context of a community, within the context of a mission statement of a university, how we're going to build a community, who we're going to allow to become, again, partly to speak, part of again, the seat at the table is the best word I want to look at here. And the reason why I mention this is that I think we need to make a couple of distinctions here in the AAUP principles. Do we think first that the principles were flawed? If so, it's a time to rethink those principles. But is the question not the principles that were flawed, but is it the implementation and the context and the practice? In a previous life, I was a director of planning, zoning, and code enforcement. On my day-to-day life, I worried about whether or not the garbage was picked up, what the dogs did on the streets, whether the streets were plowed, and so forth like that. And I say that because I am interested in the implementation of things. I get excited about wastewater treatment plants. And I say that and I say because this is the nitty-gritty of day-to-day life. And I say this because if we have to think about how we're going to make these trade-offs, and I do agree, and I said it earlier, that diversity and academic freedom come together. But if we're going to do this, I come back to my word of shared governance. It's about the question of who gets a seat at the table, who gets to decide. Is it going to be dictated from the top down? Is it going to be an open dialogue that involves faculty? Is it involve students? Is it going to involve the administration? How are we going to go about having this conversation? And that's the issue that we need to be talking about here. I actually think that the AAUP principles are great in theory. It's the application. It is the nitty-gritty in terms of putting them into practice. One last point I want to make. At the end of the day, I think there are important distinctions between free speech and academic freedom. And again, I can also put on my law professor's hat. I've taught con law for 20 years also. And I can talk about the fact that, First Amendment doctrine, we can agree with it or disagree with it. It's about content neutrality. It's about viewpoint neutrality. And you and I probably share similar concerns about that approach here. But in some sense, academic freedom at the end of the day is about truth. I see our assistant provost there. I'm looking here saying, you probably would not seriously entertain anybody who would, at the end of the day, deny the laws of physics. We have math teachers here. Nobody here seriously would entertain the idea that 1 + 1 is 3. Yes, there are certain ideas that are wrong, but I think part of what we're teaching here is teaching people why they are wrong, to teach that critical evaluation about discerning truth from falsehood. My 6th grade teacher, Grace Dale, God bless her, said to me once, you can say whatever you want in class, but the next statement is, better start with the word because, and you better have a darn good reason for why what you're saying. That's what we're in the game of, folks, here. We're in the game of teaching critical thinking and how to get people to arrive at the correct answer, assuming, I hope, there are correct answers.
Thank you very much. Dr. Angelo.
Yeah, I want to connect these two concepts that keep coming through. One is power and one is diversity and who's at the table. And I'm a former professor of education, so I would often have future teachers in front of me, and they may have been uncomfortable or morally opposed to certain aspects of that diversity, certain aspects of who we now include at the table. And they weren't required to believe that it was moral or not moral, but they were required to create an environment in which all students can learn. And an environment of hostility or invisibility is not an environment where all students can learn. And while the student population has become more diverse, unfortunately, the faculty population has not. And white faculty just simply cannot know how to create that environment if they don't see themselves as lifelong learners. So that degree of humility that mainstream education doesn't give us the capacity to engage with nuance in the ways that we've been talking about we have to actually seek that out. We can't know how to do that just because we're nice people or open-minded or see ourselves as welcoming. So I just wanted to inject that piece of humility and bring it down to the level of faculty or professor and student relationships.
And I just have one piece I'd like to add, since I ended up sounding like corporate was a terrible place. I wonder, is there a place, based on your comments, for the concept that has been very big within corporations that I call them leading corporations, because there are corporations that tend to operate, I call it, in much of the more traditional vein, and then there are those corporations who thrive by being multinational, inclusive diversity. One of the big things they talk about is this concept of, you now have 5 generations in the workplace for the first time in our history. And when I think about a perfect place for that to occur, academia has it. So as we talk about these issues, how are you thinking about that concept? You have 5 generations in your workplace, and there are significant differences in communications, expectations, beliefs, value systems, etc., all in one place, and we're all trying to get somewhere. How do you think that plays into this conversation we're having? Particularly around power.
Is that directed to me?
Yes, I am. Particularly around power, because when you think about it, it tends to be traditionalists, boomers, and some Xers who have the power, particularly on university campuses. And they've got significant numbers of millennials and Zers now coming through.
So the people sitting at the table still get to decide who is going to be included at a table, even as they make decisions that impact the lives of those who aren't included, right? And oftentimes those decision makers think it's just about inclusion, right? Let's just add more diversity into the water. And we stop there. But we're not addressing the water we're adding that diversity into, right? And that is hostile water. I mean, Michael clearly laid out the history behind why that water is hostile. It may be more subtle, although we see much more permission given to be openly and explicitly racist today. Used to be a little bit less polite to express how you really felt about those issues. And so we also have to address the consciousness of those who still control the table and for whom it's up to whether we add and who we add. And so if we're not also doing that, we can bring in more so-called, quote unquote, diversity, but we're not going to retain those folks, and they're not going to thrive because we haven't addressed the resentment that many of those 5 generations feel about having to include. And I don't know who originally said this, but when you're used to 100%, 98 feels oppressive. And we often talk about structural change, right? Well, this, you're just talking about interpersonal dynamics. What about structural change, policy change? Affirmative action was a structural policy change. Look where it is today, because we didn't address the resentments seething underneath having to include people. And so I don't think we're going to move forward without doing that.
Okay.
May I?
Certainly.
May I?
Yes, you may.
Okay. Well, a couple of observations. One of them, I want to tell a story of one of my students here, and his race was important. African American. I used to teach in the School of Business, and he talks about being hired by a local corporation. This is many years ago, by the way, and I'm not going to mention the corporation, a big one. And very first day, whisked off to diversity training. And whoever the HR director was stood in front of this new group of people who had just been hired, and it said, "We've got a really diverse group of people here." And my student raised his hand and said, "Ain't no diversity here." The instructor said, "Of course there's diversity," and went around the room and pointed out the EEOC characteristics and said, "You're African American, you're Hispanic, et cetera, et cetera." And my student said, "Ain't no diversity here." The instructor said, "What do you mean?" My student said, "Let's find out how many people here who studied economics or business as undergraduate." All the hands went up. "How many of us are working on our MBAs?" All the hands went up. My student said, you want diversity, hire art historians for a point. And what he was getting at here, and I want to get at here, and I think we're all saying the same thing in a different way, is that if we want diversity, we need to be focusing also on what? The hiring practices of institutions. We need to be looking at who we're actually bringing in. Now, before this session today, I was up at 7 a.m. doing a training session for a bunch of corporate people on a book I have coming out on generational politics, all about how the coming changes and transformations in America are tied to generational. I am never one who will argue that demographics are destiny. Demographics are possibilities. Never sort of pigeonhole and say, because you're black, because you're Hispanic, you have to believe a certain thing or act a certain way. But needless to say, if we're talking about trying to promote diversity, people with different backgrounds, different life experiences, who've experienced race, who've experienced a bunch of things, we need to do a far, far better job in hiring in academia, in recruiting our students. Because in many ways, our discussion here about diversity and academic freedom at the level we're talking about at speech here, this is probably the most superficial level that we can have in terms of discussion. At the end of the day, let's have a real discussion about real diversity and about real people who can bring real perspectives to the classroom.
So with that, I'd like to, there are several questions that they want to make certain we get out here, and then we're going to open it up for questions, because I think we've had some seeds planted, I think, in fertile ground that will spawn some very good conversation. So first of all, for you, David, what do you see as the goal of a liberal arts education, and what is the impact of controversial material? And how should academic freedom be approached and used in this regard?
Boy, that's an easy question to ask. Okay.
You opened it up. I
know. So the goals, I think there are multiple. Maybe our keynote speaker talked about being old school. I think I might have 1 year on you, so I'm not sure. So I might even be more older school than him. I still believe there's this idea of truth. I still believe at the end of the day, that part of what academia is about helping people pursue the truth and understanding and evaluating the content of ideas, of being able to realize that 1 + 1 is 2, it's not 3. It's to come to and to try to figure out how do we think through the process of gathering that type of information and making discernible statements about, let's say, right and wrong. Additionally, it is about building community. It is about the idea at the end of the day of, and I've already talked about here, it's about bringing people together and trying to forge some kind of consensus. Maybe we don't agree on everything, but it's figuring out how to agree to disagree, perhaps, on a variety of things. And then maybe where academic freedom fits in, and again, I suggested it, it's different than free speech. Academic freedom and diversity, I don't believe, in fact, I'll take the don't believe out, are not in opposition. A real sense of what it means to have academic freedom, to entertain a diversity of viewpoints, of lifestyles, of experiences. This is what we really need to have in the classroom. One of the things that I've been perplexed, and this is the goal, by the way, of liberal arts education, one of the things that so perplexes me in our society is why people are afraid of ideas. I'm not afraid of new ideas. It's the old ideas that scare to death to me. And to me, the idea of saying, let's have people critically examine them. Let's talk about critical race theory. Let's talk whatever like that. That's what we're supposed to do. That's what I learned in Teachers 101. So to me, that's what liberal arts is supposed to be about. John Dewey's, talked about what? School is supposed to prepare people to be the next generation of leaders in a democracy. I think that's what I wanted to do. And I want it to be a democracy for all. Remember our first 3 words of our Constitution? We the people? Maybe that's what we're aiming for.
Sounds great.
Drafted by all white men.
And so I'm going to follow up that question today from David with 1 to Tim. So is it possible for academic freedom to provide support for faculty, recognize power differential dynamics, as well as honor the contextual roles, experiences, and expertise that all individuals bring into the learning environment? And if so, how?
It is possible, but I think it requires something, and I think you might have used the word humility. Someone said that a few minutes ago. And I think that the academic space is not one where academicians and intellectuals are defaulting to humility, right? Because you got a certain degree of credential, and you've got those letters behind your name, and you're feeling really good about that, and you've got tenure, which is a great thing, don't get me wrong. But the point is, there comes a point where your ability to meet the students where they are, when you have such a differential power relationship to them just based on your background, takes work. It's not going to be a default. And I think for even when we're talking about the search for truth, I agree with David. I think that's an important part of the academic mission. However, let's be honest, the choices that I make as a scholar about what I teach in my class are not objective. I choose the books that I think need to be in the syllabus, that I think speak to whatever truth I want you to learn. And if you make a decision to put the bell curve in your syllabus, you are not interested in the search for truth because that entire volume was disregarded by scholars in the fields that it addressed. It was never submitted for peer review because it would have been excoriated. It was written by a popular press, a commercial press, published by such. So you could say, well, I'm teaching the bell curve because it's the search for truth, or I'm going to go into the geology department and teach flat earth theory. Well, no, you're not. And it's not a restriction of your academic freedom if you get, like, if you got into the geology department because you were a scholar and then like halfway through your tenure, like, holy shit, I think the earth is flat. They're gonna fire you, and they should. Like, if you're a historian and you've got tenure and all of a sudden, like, I don't think the Holocaust happened anymore, you're probably not gonna hold on to your job. And if somehow your tenure protections give you that protection, I guarantee you the school is gonna steer students away from your section, and you're not gonna have any students in the classroom. You might draw a paycheck, but you're not gonna have any fans and acolytes sitting there learning from you. So we've gotta have scholars who are prepared, I think, to acknowledge, going back to the intergenerational piece, that just because you've been doing it a long time doesn't mean you're good at it, right? Just because you've got a little age on you, and I got a little age on me, I'll be 55 in a couple of weeks, that doesn't make, my age, the chronology of that does not make me any better than someone who's 20 years younger than me necessarily. It's, am I keeping up with the field? Am I keeping up with the changing demographics of my school? Because if I'm still teaching the same stuff, I remember sitting on a stage several years ago at a school in Wisconsin, I can't remember which one, but we were talking about, you know, if you're a Shakespeare scholar, or you claim to be a Shakespeare scholar, but you are not familiar with feminist critiques of Shakespearean literature, or you're not familiar with anti-racist critiques of Shakespearean literature, then you are not a Shakespeare scholar anymore. If you could get in a time machine and go back to 1790, you'd be one hell of a Shakespeare scholar, or even 1915, but this is not that. And so if you're gonna be like my international relations professor in 1987, who is teaching about the Cuban Missile Crisis and pulls notes out of his briefcase that are yellowed with age and coffee stains because he wrote them the day of the Cuban Missile Crisis 25 years earlier and never updated his shit, then you do not need to be in a classroom just because you've got time and experience on your hands. And so we have to have some recognition of that, and that means I want to keep up with the latest trends. I want to keep up with, I've got younger kids, so it was easy for me. Like, I could sort of still relate to 15-year-olds because I had one, or I could relate to a 12-year-old because I had one. And my friends who didn't have kids that age could not. Like, their references were all dated. They didn't understand, you know, the new technology, and I sort of did. And that's the responsibility of an intellectual in this day and age, is to keep up with what's going on and who's going on and who's at the table. And that means you might have to teach that material that you've been teaching a little differently. Because it's not, yes, it's all about the search for truth, but someone else's identity is going to shape how they come to the material, how they see it, how they understand it. You may be able to get them where you need them to be, but you have to meet them where they are. And you won't do that unless you acknowledge some of the flaws in your own thinking and become a lifelong learner, as Robin mentioned.
Wonderful, wonderful. This next question is for you, Stacy. and we're continuing down the same process of trying to get all these thoughts out. What is the importance of recognizing and respecting diversity, diversity of identity, thought, regionality, and how does that impact learning opportunities?
Again, I think that this goes back to this idea that even in 1915, the concept of academic freedom was one about the academic enterprise, not just faculty, but at least nominally also on behalf of students, right? The production of knowledge, not simply for the production of knowledge, but for the dissemination of that knowledge, the perpetuation of that knowledge on behalf of those who would propagate that in future generations. And so, again, I think that we have to think about this idea that inherent in academic freedom, and even the AAUP definition of academic freedom, there is a built-in limitation, which is you can only exercise academic freedom with academic responsibility. And that academic responsibility is not just about peer review, right? And kind of the standards of your discipline to know what is the accepted wisdom about the fact of your subject of expertise. It is also about understanding what are the appropriate pedagogical approaches, right, to the dissemination of knowledge within a classroom that foster an environment of learning. And in a context in which we are not any longer teaching all white males, even though our faculties remain, as Robin said, far more white and male than our student bodies, we have to take that academic responsibility seriously. And so I think that it's inherent in the concept itself that we don't get to wield academic freedom without acknowledging and taking seriously our academic responsibility, not just in the search for truth, making sure that we know what the standards of our discipline are about the fact, right, of our areas of expertise, but also thinking about how we manage our classrooms and our pedagogies around students. And in that regard, I think that we would be remiss if we did not have some shared governance where we at least invited perspective from students about what's appropriate, what's effective. And so I mentioned a story, and I think it was in an earlier draft of the article, but in any event, Jeffrey Stone, who's at University of Chicago, which is famous, right, for its academic freedom commitment, told a story about how he used to use the N-word in a First Amendment class that he taught until he was pulled aside by his students, including in particular Black students, who explained to him how problematic for their own learning his use of that word in the classroom was. And taking seriously his obligation, right, to exercise his academic freedom with academic responsibility, he ceded, right, his right to use that word in the classroom because he accepted his students' representation that it was not responsible pedagogy. And that's what we all have to do. I think we all have to balance. We have to understand that inherent in our right for academic freedom is the responsibility, right, to serve students in the academic enterprise in ways that ensure that their learning is meaningful, that they have the opportunity to be full participants, that they are not silenced, that they are not diminished in our classrooms. And that is part of our obligation as academics.
Well, thank you. You actually answered my follow-up question, so I was going to ask for an example, and you gave it before I asked for it, so thank you for that. So with that, I'd like to move on to Robin, and I'm going to ask you this, and know that I'm choosing these words, not necessarily words I choose to use, but I want to frame it so that everyone understands because we've been hearing it this way. It would seem cancel culture and wokeness are prominent in society and on campuses. How can colleges and universities promote and practice critically engaging dissenting points of view along with the experiences and perspectives that contribute to them?
Thank you. You know, I had said earlier that all opinions are not equal and the classroom is not a place where everybody just freely shares their opinions. opinions are important in the sense of getting underneath them. So where does your opinion come from? How did you get it? How does it function? Who does it serve? So being willing and able to think critically about the world is different than just stating the way you see the world as fact or as equal to somebody else. So I want to be clear about that. The ability for popular culture to use the language, cancel, say, misogynists or white nationalists that other avenues have not censured has been of critical importance. It has been kind of an incredible tool to accomplish that kind of censoring. And here's a both end here. There's a difference between hate speech, which is banned, and someone who you don't agree with, or who made a mistake, or said something stupid, or is prejudiced or biased, right? Drowning out or preventing someone from speaking, I think is problematic. I don't think that's useful. You are free to protest their speech, but to silence them and not allow them to speak isn't helpful. And it reinforces a couple of problematic ideas. So I'm just going to grab out of my head. Prince Harry, several years ago, wears a Nazi costume to a Halloween party. It was stupid. It was ignorant. And yet focusing on him as the bad person who now no one can listen to or provide a forum for reinforces this idea that only some people do stupid and ignorant things. Only some people are prejudiced or biased when we all are. So let me be really clear when I say everybody is prejudiced, everybody has bias. I want to make the distinction that, and some of our biases collectively are backed with institutional power, and some groups' biases are not. So I'm not saying that they're equal in impact, but we all have them. And we don't want to reinforce this idea, kind of the bad apple idea, right? It takes us out of a structural understanding of how hierarchies are maintained and reproduced. And it doesn't allow people to learn and grow from their mistakes. Right? It doesn't allow people to change, if you will, right? And what it does is inculcate a culture of fear, where people are afraid to grapple with what they may be struggling with, venture forth and say, okay, I hear you, but I'm really having trouble with this piece here because my whole life I've been reinforced on this piece here. Can you help me see what I'm missing? If we don't have room for that kind of dialogue, we've lost compassion, and we've lost basically an environment in which we can all learn.
Excellent. And so I guess the question I have here is that, again, as the general report of the Committee on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure identifies that the term academic freedom has traditionally had two applications: to the freedom of the teacher and to that of the student. How can institutions foster and further an understanding of academic freedom as it relates to students? And that's open to whoever wants to respond first and get it going.
I'll go.
Okay.
It goes back to the point I was making. I'm sorry. It goes back to the point I was making earlier. It's about the concept of shared governance. Now, I know we generally, and I think you were making a similar point too. Now, I know we generally think of the topic of shared governance as sort of a faculty prerogative, but I think it's really broader. I really think it's a broader notion in terms of saying that we need to have students involved also in terms of thinking about curriculum. Now, what I know some of my colleagues are thinking of, and what some people are afraid of, is say, oh, you're talking about vetoes. No, we're not talking about vetoes. What we're talking about is generally having a conversation about how do we talk about difficult issues on campus or in our society. I mean, one of the things that we haven't talked about today here is the fact that, maybe it's too I was going to say, one of the things I was going to talk about is the fact that we have a civility code on campus. I wrote it for the university. It's about an effort to try to figure out how do we have discussions about difficult topics and do it in a way that's civil. And civil doesn't have to mean always what? Yes, no, and be polite. I'm from New York. I kid people and say that when we disagree with one another, or we think somebody's wrong, we just think it's because they're hard of hearing, and so we raise the volume or something like that. But what I'm getting at here, there's got to be a way that we can have all the relevant stakeholders at the table in terms of being able to say, how do we approach these issues? But it also has to be that recognition, as we've been talking about here, about power hierarchies too. Because I think right now, I think the concern is the fact that some people don't feel like that even if they say, well, the door is open, or here's the chair, go sit in it, they don't really feel like that it's a genuine gesture or something like that. So to me, and again, I would be a fool. I'd be a total fool to say that alone solves the issue. But until we really have the sense in which we can have a genuine dialogue, and I think a lot of the problems on campuses right now, I'm not even going to get to our society. I mean, that takes us to a whole different discussion here. But a lot of our problems on campuses go back to my opening statements. It's about the corporatization of the university. It's about the way we've restructured education to where we've commodified knowledge, and we've really have, I think, twisted badly what we're trying to accomplish in terms of our education. And I still think Dewey's ideal about saying we're here to produce the next generation of Democrats, small letter D, I don't mean big letter D, is a pretty good goal.
Okay, so could I do one little follow-up to that? I understand what you're saying, and in particular, as you talk about liberal arts colleges in particular are feeling the strain. I come from a place where money's no issue right now, but I want to make certain I'm understanding in that environment where you are literally struggling for survival, how does what you're saying manifest itself?
Well,
how would you have it manifest itself?
Well, okay, so there's a lot of issues here about the economics of higher education that we could talk about too. It's about what we recognize as priorities in our society. And yes, I know there's going to be a lot of administrators out there who are going to say, all right, at $50,000 or $60,000 or $70,000 a year, higher education is still a bargain because you get your return on investment later in life. But let's be realistic. For people who are first generation college, and that included me, my father never went to high school, my mother was a cook, going to college is difficult. And it's very expensive. And so to me, that we need to be addressing that issue also. I mean, what we can't address with our debate, the way we're framing it right now, on academic freedom and diversity, we can't address the cost of higher education. We can't address so many of these other problems that are impacting really what we're trying to do in the classroom here. Again, I wish I had a magic wand. I wish I knew how to solve all this kind of stuff. But yes, for a lot of our students, it is going to college. It is about the fact that this is the leg up. It is the way of entering, I don't know, middle class, whatever we're calling it here. But we're not doing enough in our society to make that possible for people to get to college, to be able to do that. It's the pipeline issue.
Can I add something to that real quick? Going back to the shared governance idea, because this is really important. I definitely agree. It's vital that students be involved at the most basic level, even in the development of curriculum, and what's going to be studied and how it's going to be studied. I also would go one step further and say the community needs to be involved, right? Beyond the walls of the institution. There's a horrible divide that exists in most of our private institutions in particular, but even many sort of large flagship state public institutions between town and gown. And it's because we treat the community sort of like these others who we really don't bump shoulders with, and we certainly have nothing to learn from them. Well, listen, I was a community organizer for about 2 years in New Orleans after I got out of school, and I learned far more about the way the class system in this country operates and the way that white supremacy operates from people that did not have college degrees. Many did not have high school diplomas than I ever learned in a college class, and that is not meant as disrespectful to my faculty and professors that I had at Tulane uptown in New Orleans, but it was learning from folks in the lower Ninth Ward. It was learning from folks in Central City. It was learning from folks in the Treme that actually explained to me some of those concepts. Now, why can't we be bringing those folks in to the conversation about how Tulane is going to operate? Well, there is one way that we could at least begin to, and you talk a lot about operationalization. How do we take it from theory to practice? After Katrina, y'all remember, maybe you don't, you might not have known this, but Tulane went on this big PR thing where they decided they were going to become the campus that cares. That was their branding and marketing, genius branding and marketing. And that's, again, said cynically with my I don't want college to become corporate voice. But they were brilliant at it, and they got all these people to come 2 years after this flooding. At one, first year, nobody wanted to send their kids to Tulane for school because they didn't know if it was going to exist in 2 or 3 years. It might flood again, But then all of a sudden they did this branding. They decided they're going to have all of this service learning requirements. And a lot of our schools have that. I don't know if Hamlin does, but I know a lot of schools, right, have service learning requirements. And I remember talking to some of the people at Tulane about it. I said, this is great, but in order for me to think this isn't just PR, that this is really about breaking down the barriers between the community you're serving or you claim to serve and the people you're going to send to do the good work of service, you're going to have to do more than just send the students out and then, because I said, who gives them the grade for the service they perform? Like, who actually makes the decision what grade they get on that service learning project? And they looked at me quizzically like I asked them the most ridiculous question. Well, obviously the professor does. I said, see, that doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't the community get to issue the grade, right? Why don't the people who you supposedly served why are they not given the power to determine whether you did a good job or not? Because they're the ones who you're supposed to be helping. So all of a sudden, there's one way that we could begin in something like service learning to involve the community in the actual dispensation of reward for supposedly helping them. If we want to create some type of symbiotic relationship there, you give them the power. And Tulane folks looked at me like, I don't think we can really do that, because the professors wanted to give the grade. They wanted to be the ones to make the determination. But I think that there are ways that we can begin to do that, to break down some of those barriers, to involve organic intellectuals from the community, like those folks I met in public housing communities who could have been brought in. You're not necessarily going to put them on your tenure track because I know you got your rules, you got your policies, but they could be coming in and giving guest lectures and being paid for their wisdom, right? Being paid for their wisdom that they are dying for literally every day. And then all of a sudden, some of that humility we talked about, some of the ability to expand real academic freedom and real diversity of thought, hearing the experiences of people who've never even been on that campus. They lived in New Orleans their whole life. They've never been on this campus. They lived here their whole lives. They've never been, at whatever school. That's something we've got to get to as well if we're really serious about maximizing both academic freedom and the search for truth.
And so it's actually making certain you think of your stakeholders much more broadly.
Right, exactly.
Okay?
Yeah.
You have a perspective.
So I think that there are so many ways, and this is going back to my first point, that we are evolving our understanding of the project of the academic enterprise and who our stakeholders are and who should be engaged in the project of setting these terms of engagement. And so I think that one of the things that comes to mind in terms of sharing this power with students is that I teach a class, it's a small seminar class, and this is true of all of the classes that I teach, but particularly of this class, where I tell my students at the beginning of every semester, I learn as much from you as you are going to learn from me. This is a shared enterprise of knowledge production and exploration. And so for faculty, again, to take the point of, to lack the humility to understand that we are not the sole progenitors of knowledge in the academy is folly, right? I mean, it's just silly. And to the extent that, and again, I think in 1915, nominally even students were acknowledged, but I think that we can rethink these things anew. As Maya Angelou would say, when you know better, do better. And we know better now. And we have an opportunity. There is nothing that is fixing us to these rules of the past. I teach constitutional law. I think that, and I believe in living constitutionalism. I think that that's not only a kind of ideological and theoretical idea. It is a practical reality about how we live constitutionalism in this country. And I think that the same can be true about academic freedom. We can have a living principle of academic freedom that continuously evolves to accommodate whatever new ideas, expressions, or compositions we find ourselves enmeshed in the academy. And it reminds me also of a new kind of project that I've heard from some of my colleagues in the legal academy, but I understand that this is happening all over, which is that oftentimes, because we are the centers of knowledge production, we are called upon by the public to be subject matter experts, right? That we are seen as the subject matter experts, but it turns out that in a lot of disciplines, right, we rely on the production of knowledge that comes from the community, right? That comes from people who are not themselves academic, who are generating the information that we then translate, right, for the public. And what we need to begin to do is to give credit where credit is due, right? That those are experts as well, who are laboring alongside of us, making our work possible. And while we have not always accounted for them, there's nothing that stops us from saying, we've been doing it wrong. We know better now and we can do better. And to expand our concepts of academic freedom and those people who we consider experts and those people who have, right, part of the shared governance, to include those people. I think that that is part of what we are called upon to do. I think that that is our obligation. And, you know, I think that that's just the way in which the world works.
Sounds great. Robin, do you have something you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, these clearly are not easy issues. And systems of oppression are highly adaptive. They adapt to challenges. They co-opt those challenges. Look at the summer of 2020 and where we are today, right? As Carol Anderson argues so powerfully, every inch of Black progress has been met with a backlash of white rage. Look where we are. So again, these are not easy. They are not simple. We are up against deeply powerful investments in the status quo, in systems of oppression. And so what I would say is that if you are not able to engage with these issues with some nuance and some complexity and some humility, you are not qualified to teach. And we've talked about hiring. I wish we actually saw this as a qualification, not to have the answer. They're not easy or simple, and I do not claim to have it. But again, the nuance, the complexity, the willingness, it's got to be seen as a qualification if we're going to be preparing people to lead going forward.
Thank you. Go ahead.
How do we encourage experimentation and innovation and evolution? I can't remember who told the story about the yellow notes. I can't remember which one it was. Was you? I couldn't remember what it was. And the very first day, my first teaching job was Gustavus Adolphus. My department chair, bless his heart, said, "Let me give you one bit of advice. Remember, the paradigm of the bad teacher comes in with the yellow notes that have maybe at best a couple of like changes on or like that." He said, "Don't be that teacher." He said, "Be the person who always experiments, always innovates, always takes a chance." This semester, for example, all 3 of my classes, I fully incorporated ChatGPT. I have no idea what the hell's going to happen, what's going to produce. But the point that I'm getting at is that I'm a little uncomfortable in class. My students are uncomfortable in class. But we're in it together to try to figure it out. And again, going back to my corporatization model, I think one of the things that's being lost in higher education right now, as we sort of do this corporatization of higher education, as every class has to look like every other class, we're losing the ability to experiment. We're losing the ability to innovate, to evolve the ways that you say we need to do. And I agree. And what we need to do is, in the same way that business and industry is perplexed with how do we encourage innovation, experimentation, I think one of the things I'd like us to come out of this session at the end of the day is to say, what are some of the tools? What are the ways that institutions can support this necessary evolution for faculty? I mean, I'm bored by doing the same old stuff the same old way, and I keep changing things all the time. And sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I get it wrong or something. But Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? And that facilitates the ability, I think, to become better teachers, better scholars, better students.
Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing the things that make you uncomfortable. And that takes a lot in front of everyone, because as a professor, I think sometimes the expectation is that there's going to be perfect and you already know it. And I appreciate your taking the time to say, I'm doing something and I don't know how it's going to turn out. And that's really what I think is important for us as part of this dialogue, because I don't want this to be a discussion and it's not a debate. It's about dialogue where you effectively are listening to the perspectives of others so that it enhances your perspective. And so I've got one last piece before we are able to open it up, because we want to use these to make certain we're getting your thought processes going so that you can ask some meaningful questions. According to John Dewey, education should reinforce the values necessary to produce the next generation of democracy's leaders. Given that we live in a pluralist society with a diversity of views, should college campuses expose students to ideas they disagree with? And what should schools do to prepare students to address diverse viewpoints, including those that make them uncomfortable? And I'm going to let whoever wants to jump into this one first.
Does anybody disagree with that statement? I mean, I think that's pretty foundational. But I think everyone has acknowledged that, and you know, the Reverend Dr. Dyson gave me credit for, but I mean, I think that this is really where we have to understand the complexity and the nuance inherent in. And this is the one thing that I slightly disagree with you about, which is that I do think that there is tension, not necessarily in theory conflict between diversity and academic freedom. I do. I think that they are interdependent, right, in theory, but in practice, there is tensions. There are real tensions that I think we have all either experienced personally or are familiar with, that especially as we look at those who are in front of the classroom increasingly having, right, different identities and experiences than those people who are sitting in the room. And so I think that we really just have to bring some humility, right? And, you know, from the other perspective, we have to have grace. I think that Dr. D'Angelo said that what we have to understand is that mistakes will be made. Right? We're not always going to get it right. We're not always going to get it right from either side, but we have to give ourselves space to learn and grow. That is what we are about as an academic institution. And so I think that faculty certainly need to be trained. They have to take seriously their responsibility as stewards of the academic enterprise to engage in the kind of pedagogy of learning with a sense of responsibility for getting it right, understanding that, you know, sometimes you experiment, right? And you learn and you ask for the kind of grace that you're going to need to make mistakes, and hopefully you get that grace. But you also exercise a humility that says, look, I'm going to ask you guys, how did you think that went, right? Or you know, as Dr. Dyson said in the beginning when he had to learn about trigger warnings, okay, maybe I didn't quite get that right the first time, but I'm committed, right? Or he had to change his examples, right, to update them from Snoop Dogg to Lil Baby, right? Because we are committed to the project of getting this right. But I do think that we have to recognize that it can't always be about simply, you know, canceling everyone or condemning everyone for the first misstep, because this is difficult. It's hard work, and we are here to learn and to grow. And that necessarily requires all of us to be invested in that project.
And I agree with that statement that you read, except I do think it's important to point out that institutions of higher learning also have to make judgment calls based on the number of days in a school year, based on the amount of space on a campus. So for instance, when it comes to guest speakers, outside speakers, there is not enough time in the day or enough days in the calendar to have every view on every issue represented by guest lecturers. And an institution of higher learning, as opposed to like the street corner, where you could put down a soapbox and talk about, you know, 9/11 was an inside job and the moon is not real or whatever. Like, you know, a school has an obligation to be like, okay, actually, we're not going to entertain all ideas. We don't have to invite Richard Spencer or some other overt white nationalist. And the reason we can justify not doing it is because part of our mission statement is not just the search for truth, which says we need more speech, but it's also the idea of building community. And I've read every one of y'all's damn mission statements, like every college. They're all the same. They were all created by some mission monk in a cave somewhere. And it all says we are here to create, get this, you can look it up, lifelong learners in a global environment. I don't even know what the hell that means, but all of y'all, every school says that. So if you're Richard Spencer and you're coming to talk about the supremacy of the white race and the need to separate the races, you are clearly in violation of some of the key tenets of that mission statement, and I don't think they have to indulge you any more than a flat earther. Now, having said that, if they make the decision to bring you, and if protests against that idea do not carry the day, and that fool is brought on, I agree with Robin. I don't believe in shouting people down. I think there are more effective ways to terrorize Nazis than to shout them down. I think if you sit on your hands, you turn your back, you all wear the same color shirt. That's what, you know, Herbert Hoover was driven like mad. During the Depression, he would go through the country on trains, and people wouldn't yell at him. They would just sit there and stare at him like, you've screwed it up, man. And he was like, his blood pressure spiked. I think he might have had a heart attack. I'm not sure, historians in the room, whether he really freaked out. Like, there are lots of ways to handle it, but preferably a school should be a place where we have that conversation and we say, actually, we're not gonna expose people to every idea, because there are some ideas that are so antithetical to one of our core mission statements, the building of community, that we're not gonna indulge it. Just like a church is not really gonna have like a militant atheist give the sermon on Sunday. It's not because they might love that person, but it's like, no, but that's sort of not our thing. You know, so we love you, and you come in, have cookies, have punch, but we're not going to actually give you the microphone, and we're certainly not going to pay you, right? And so I think you do have to draw lines, and then we just have a discussion about where do we draw them, because we'll all draw them somewhere. We're all going to draw them at the Flat Earther. We're all going to draw them at the Holocaust denier in the history department. Why? If you couldn't get a job in the department, why should you get a paycheck for a guest lecture? Like, if what you're saying is so counter to everything in the discipline? I think we can make some of those decisions, and so we just have to have those debates with humility, with honesty, and try to realize that you can't really ever be exposed to all the ideas, and schools have to make certain judgment calls. Hopefully, if we're all making those decisions together, they'll make good ones.
Any points you want to make before we open it up for the audience?
Just quickly first, I agree with that statement since I wrote it, by the way, that question. But two, this is kind of just a general plea, maybe for everybody. I think a few of us are saying it here, is that maybe we should sometimes make that distinction between mistakes, not knowing, et cetera, et cetera. And I say that because I sometimes see with my students, people not always looking for the better angels in people. I don't know about you. I misspeak. You know, my joke will be, I only have two flaws: what I say and what I do. You know, but the point is that I misspeak. Every one of us in this room who stood before has made mistakes or are not realized all of what we're saying. And what I think is what we need to have is a sense of, I guess you're saying what, humility, compassion, or something. That if somebody in class, one of your classmates, says something, let's not immediately think, you know, they're an evil person. Let's use it as an occasion to say, well, what did you mean, or something like that. Because I'm afraid that if we don't recognize the fact at the end of the day that we're humans, we're going to shut down everything.
Okay. With that, I think David's in the back and a couple
I'm
other.
in the back. Carlos is on the side over
Okay.
there. If there are any questions on either side or in the middle, we will get to you ASAP.
Okay. So my general observation, this is more of just like, can you help me understand if I'm following? I was born in 1990, so I'm a solid millennial, of which, are any of you millennials on the stage? No? No, okay, that's fine.
But thanks for asking.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you guys are
We
looking
just
pretty good.
look like them.
It's your cushy academia jobs. Anyway, so what I have gleaned from reflecting here in the back and having some interesting side conversations is that if I've learned from Schoolhouse Rock that knowledge is power, and then I learned from Spider-Man that with great power comes great responsibility, and then our charge, or your charge, I'm not a professor, as academics of privilege, is to teach others how to discern truth from fiction and to show your work, which is what I learned in geometry class in 8th grade, proofs. Am I following? Is that the takeaway, or is that so culturally enmeshed in American culture that it's kind of gross?
I mean, I think that is a collection of cliches that accurately captures what we have said in general. I would agree with that.
Hi, I've really enjoyed listening to all of you, and I've kind of been thinking about some of the points you've touched on, specifically around the corporatization of higher education and the economic issues surrounding that. And I think for me personally, those things just cannot be separated from issues of academic freedom. So I'm a religion major here at Hamlin. I started my career in higher education in the United States at a different institution. A semester into my education there, my major was eliminated, and half the department was also eliminated. So when we're talking about these issues of educating student body and creating students who come into the workforce with diverse views and the ability to interact with diverse opinions, what do you all make of the fact that at many private and even public institutions, the disciplines that, although many of them have harrowing pasts, are changing in a way that really allow these conversations to happen, like religious studies, ethnic studies, cultural studies, are being eliminated and are being eroded. And in many of these cases are still predominantly, like was already mentioned, the faculty are predominantly white men. So if these institutions, if these departments that can really help students become informed citizens, have these conversations, are being eroded, how are we going to have scholars in these departments who are going to raise the next generation of, you know, the people who, the art historian major or the religion major that you want to work in these corporations? How can we square that with this discussion of academic freedom?
That's a really good question, you know, because we're looking at two different things here. I mean, one of them, if we go back in history, in many cases, disciplinary boundaries are artificial. I mean, they're a product of a whole bunch of different things that have happened over time. Political science separating from economics, so forth like that. Or I was going to say, I teach in Europe a lot. Political science, public administration, economics, I mean, they're fused in very different ways. But that's a different discussion than I think than what you're raising here. But you're raising, I think, a really central problem at this point is that, which gets to my point about the corporatization of education, where it is what? Majors that are being offered, classes that are being offered are being done and calculated on the basis of return on investments at this point. And yeah, I understand institutions, you know, our businesses, they have to worry about bottom lines, they can't run deficits. But again, maybe this comes back to first about the shared governance issue too, but something even beyond that, which I don't know, I can't solve this here, is maybe it also says something about society's values at this point. You know, when we start to say that we put far more value on saying that it's only about a business degree and we don't care about theologians or we don't care about art historians or something like that, I don't know how to resolve that question. I mean, to me, a world that's full of art historians, theologians, musicians, the next Beethoven, the next rap singer, whatever like that, is an important world for me. I just don't know how, and I'm just confessing this, I don't know how to address that problem.
So I want to distinguish between two different phenomenon, because I think that part of what we've also talked about is the kind of silencing or censoring of ideas, like the kind of critical race theory and, you know, not teaching, you know, certain concepts like ethnic studies or things like that. I think all of which, by the way, are politically motivated, right? Like that's driven by a political agenda to censure. I think that is antithetical to diversity. However, and I have to disclaim by saying that I spent half my career as a corporate lawyer. And so I am now part of the academic enterprise, and I fully appreciate the kind of classical liberal tradition of higher education and the kind of especially liberal studies. But those are economic decisions, right? And economic decisions have to be made, right? And so Tim was just talking about, when you're talking about who you're going to invite as speakers, right? You can make decisions about the economics of whether or not it makes sense to promote certain ideas if you have limited budgets. I think at the end of the day, if we're not talking about a political agenda to censure certain ideas because of the content of those ideas, and instead we're talking about making economic decisions about what we can responsibly, in terms of fiscal responsibility, fund as an institution, I think that those are hard but necessary choices that don't raise the same implications for our commitment to diversity, right, that those other ideas and those other phenomena do.
And the only thing I would add to that is that I think there's a bit of a, it's very hard to tell the motivation behind those attacks sometimes. We don't always know. Sometimes they look like budgetary decisions. So what West Virginia just did, West Virginia University's like shut down 15 departments, and by the way, these are not just like cultural studies department. Like WVU was not known for its ethnic studies department. Like that's not like they may have one, but it's not like that's what they were going after. They were shutting down math programs. They're shutting down, could it be that that's just budgetary? It might be, because West Virginia is a poor state. They have budget issues vis-a-vis their higher ed system. But a lot of times when we talk about it as, well, this is a major that isn't going to pay off and isn't going to get you work, that oftentimes is camouflage for what is really a critique of art history, because really, who wants to study that anyway? And what kind of people study that? And those are the kind of things that get mocked by the so-called practical people who want everybody to go into STEM. Now, keep in mind, and I don't want to hate on STEM. Some of y'all got to do that. I'm glad that there are people who love that and are good at that. I was not that boy. So I'm really glad that some of y'all are going to be engineers and build bridges, because I like my bridges to not fall apart, and I like somebody that can do math and all of that science stuff. But here's the thing. If everybody goes into those fields, if everybody gets a computer degree, if everybody gets a business degree, if everybody gets an engineering degree, guess what? Some of y'all not going to have work, because that will create a glut. That's like basic econ 101. So you really don't want everybody to be getting these practical degrees, because pretty soon they won't be practical anymore. You want to, and any employer will tell you they would actually prefer to have the art history major, the communications major, somebody who can write, somebody who's good at oral communication, which you may not learn in certain fields, right? So we want to push back on those decisions, not only when they're clearly ideological, but when they are short-term, short-sighted budgetary decisions, because in the long run, that program may be the thing that brings in the student that does some really amazing thing that they end up giving that school millions of dollars. You don't know what's going to happen with that. And so I don't think we want to let folks shut down departments just because they say they don't pay for themselves. Because in the long run, the ones that do pay for themselves won't either, if everybody goes into those fields. And then they'll have to, well, God, I've got to get rid of engineering now. No, you're not going to do that, but half of your graduates don't have work, or a third of your graduates don't have work, or 20% don't. So I think we want to try to hold the line as much as possible, and also think about the purpose of education. It isn't just training school. It isn't just professional certification school. We could all go and get a professional certification in certain things if that's what we wanted. The purpose of education is not just what Dewey said it was in that quote from earlier, but it's also what, Teresa Perry, brilliant educational philosopher who looks at black educational models in particular, talks about when she says the point of education was freedom for literacy and literacy for freedom. In other words, the point for black people was never, we're going to get a good education so we can move up and get the best job, because we knew we couldn't get the best jobs under segregation. Education's purpose was collective liberation. All of us or none of us. You have to be educated to get free, and you got to be free to get educated. And so the purpose was communal uplift. If the purpose is communal uplift, you want as many programs, as many disciplines as possible for people to get what they need. And that's not all going to be STEM, and it's not all going to be, whatever. It's going to be a multiplicity of things, and we need to defend them to the extent possible, even though I know, as you said, there are budget decisions which occasionally will have to be made. But I think we want to at least sound the alarm about that. Even if we're not able to stop that, we want to say that's a crisis situation that we shouldn't accept willingly or gladly.
I think one of the other crises too is the fact, let's look at this, and again, this is probably more of a general discussion, but let's be Minnesota specific. We're looking at the MnSCU system. For those of you who don't know what MnSCU is, it's the public college system in Minnesota. Its enrollment is down 40% compared to 10 years ago. St. Cloud, which is 50 miles north of here, they're hemorrhaging at about 50% down. This is all, and so at some point, these are all programs that are cutting back with austerity. Well, you can't cut yourself to prosperity. That's the other issue. And as they're cutting these programs back, as they're trimming them away, they're also turning away a lot of students, including lots of students of color and so forth like that. And remember, we live in the state, unfortunately, of George Floyd. We live in a state that has among the worst racial disparities in healthcare, education, employment, criminal justice of any states in the country. I mean, we are, even before the demographic cliff, the enrollment cliff is going to hit every school in the country very soon. We're already feeling it here. And part of the issue about maybe eliminating these programs being made for budgetary purposes, the part that maybe higher education can't control right now, is the fact that we are making incredibly stupid choices in this state on a whole range of issues about race that are just adding to the problems and compounding the problems that higher education has. And somewhere along the line, we need to figure out, we need to do something to address those issues, because if we didn't have those racial disparities, maybe there would be more students who'd be at 18 years old who'd want to go to college, who'd want to major in art history, who would want to major in theology and music. We're just cutting ourselves off at our own feet.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I just want to go back to when it is ideological, when those programs are cut, because we're at a serious and terrifying crossroads in this country. And I was taught, of course, that history is this arc of progress, always going forward. And it should be very clear today that it is never just an arc going forward. It is a constant push and pull, and every inch towards more social justice is pushed back against, and I'd say we're a couple of inches in the other way at this point. And so we just cannot be complacent. We can't be. We can't sit back and think it's all going to work itself out. It's accelerating, and I want to pick up Michael's point earlier about getting on school boards and getting involved. It just won't happen otherwise, right? If they don't speak for you, then speak up and don't let them speak for you, right? We need more books and more ideas and so on. I want to give a shout out to a group called Red Wine and Blue. It used to be like a white ladies book group, and now they are parents, mostly white parents, who absolutely say, no, you don't speak for us. We want our children to have these books. And they're an activist organization that you can get involved in. There's a lot going on out there. But I guess if this is the last comment I make, I want it to be get involved. They are involved.
Panelists, thank you so much. Dr. D'Angelo, Dr. Schultz, Professor Hawkins, Brother Wise, and our moderator, Denise Holloman. Can you please give them a round of applause? I know there were a couple of hands that we couldn't get to. I'm pretty sure if they can stick around while we break for lunch, maybe there can be some one-on-one conversations or questions asked in exchange while some folks go out and break for lunch and then come back for our table discussions. But other than that, lunch is ready, so you can proceed out to the lobby. And then we'll welcome you all back for the afternoon of table discussions.
And lunch is served in 2 lines.